In November 1942, the skies of North Africa shook with fierce battles. Under the command of General Eisenhower, the Allies launched Operation Torch, landing on the coasts of Algeria and Morocco. The German and Italian divisions, long accustomed to the brutal desert front, now found themselves at a disadvantage. Within just a few months, tens of thousands of Axis soldiers were encircled and forced to surrender. Among them were large numbers of Germans from Field Marshal Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. They did not yet know that after laying down their arms, their fate would be tied to a journey halfway across the globe to the distant United States. At the ports of Oran and Casablanca, long columns of prisoners were herded onto transport ships. Many still clung to a faint hope that they might be exchanged for Allied soldiers and return home soon. But rumors began to spread across the decks. The Americans are taking us to their country. The news left many stunned. To them, the United States was an unfamiliar land, one the Nazi propaganda machine had painted in terrifying colors. A cruel, even barbaric enemy, ready to humiliate and starve its captives. The thought of being sent there made many shudder. The voyage across the Atlantic lasted weeks. The prison ships moved silently through dangerous waters, where German U-boats prowled for Allied prey. Some whispered bitterly, "How ironic that we are being carried away on ships our own comrades might sink at any moment." By day, the men were crammed into narrow holds. By night, the pounding of waves and the stench of oil kept sleep at bay. In January 1943, the ships finally reached America, docking mainly in New York, Virginia, and Louisiana. When the hatches opened, the prisoners stepped onto the piers and were confronted with an entirely new world. Bustling American cities rose before them, filled with skyscrapers, streams of cars, and people in colorful clothes. Many Germans were dumbfounded. Nazi propaganda had long depicted the U.S. as a decaying, impoverished nation ruined by economic crisis. What they saw before their eyes was the opposite. As soon as they set foot on American soil, they were lined up, inspected, and loaded onto trains bound for prison camps deep inland. Through the train windows, the prisoners gazed out at endless cornfields, quiet little towns, and ordinary Americans going about their lives as though the war in Europe were some distant affair. For many, it was a cultural shock. The enemy they had imagined lived not in ruin, but in a vast, wealthy country, seemingly untouched by war. Prisoner-of-war camps sprang up across the nation: Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Minnesota, California. Some were old military bases strung with barbed wire. Others were makeshift wooden compounds built on open plains. Inside, American guards handed out rations on schedule: bread, canned meat, potatoes, even coffee, a luxury rarely seen by German soldiers at the front. On their first night in camp, many prisoners sighed, bracing for the harshness of captivity. One whispered in the dark, "At least we won't starve." Indeed, for many, the first shock of life in America was not beatings or deprivation, but the strange comfort of being full. The next morning, when the camp bell rang, they were marched outside for roll call. Some young American guards tried out clumsy German phrases, teasing but never striking them. Through a translator, the camp commandant explained, "You are prisoners of war. We follow the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will be fed. Keep discipline." To the captives, these words were unexpected. It was a world turned upside down. Their enemy invoked international law not to threaten, but to reassure. In the weeks that followed, camp life settled into rhythm. Prisoners attended English lessons, played soccer, or labored in assigned tasks. Some sketched, others played music. German officers tried to preserve military order with drills, salutes, even secret meetings. But most ordinary soldiers gradually let down their guard. They discovered that here, hunger, cold, and fear had disappeared. Yet the moments that lingered most in their minds came not from within the barbed wire, but from rare encounters with Americans outside. At times, POWs were sent to work on farms, filling the labor gap left by men who had gone to war. Out in the wide fields, they met American women toiling in overalls, elderly farmers driving tractors, and children taking on heavy household chores. It was there that the seeds of a new story began. Shared simple meals, curious glances, and something they had never expected: kindness from the enemy. As winter passed, the prisoners who had once feared death began to realize that their new life in America would not be merely survival, but a strange journey where every prejudice would be tested. They could not yet know that in these years, many of them would carry home a memory utterly different from what Berlin had taught them, a memory of humanity in wartime. In the spring of 1943, the POW camps across the Midwest began to take on a new rhythm. As the wheat fields grew tall, the shortage of farm labor in rural America became urgent. Millions of American men were overseas, in Europe, North Africa, or the Pacific, leaving behind small towns populated mostly by women, children, and the elderly. The government decided to send German prisoners out to work beyond the camp fences, in full compliance with the Geneva Convention. POWs could be employed in non-military labor and would even receive pay. That morning, more than 30 prisoners were roused early. They stood in line under the sun, caps in hand. A military truck pulled up to the gate. The guard barked, "Get in!" The steel door slammed shut. The engine roared, and through the cracks they saw the dirt road stretching into the fields. Inside, a question lingered in everyone's mind. What will happen today? After nearly an hour, the truck stopped at a large farm. It belonged to the Miller family, German Americans who had settled there in the 19th century. Mr. Miller was away with the Air Force, leaving his wife and 2 children to tend the land. When she saw the POW truck stop at her gate, Mrs. Miller narrowed her eyes, her face tight with unease. To her, these men about to step down were the enemy, the same enemy her husband was fighting across the Atlantic. The truck doors creaked open. One by one, the prisoners climbed down and formed a silent line. They wore faded gray uniforms marked with the letters PW, Prisoner of War. From behind a wooden fence, the Miller children peeked out wide-eyed, seeing real Germans for the first time in their lives. The first tasks were pulling weeds, digging ditches, and clearing the cornfields. Mrs. Miller kept her distance, speaking curtly to the American guard who accompanied them. "I don't want them near the house. They can work out in the fields." The guard shrugged. "They'll work. Don't worry. We'll keep an eye on them." That entire day, the prisoners labored hard under the sun. They did not complain. After months confined behind barbed wire, simply breathing in the countryside air and seeing green fields again was a quiet comfort. Still, silence hung in the air, the Americans suspicious, the Germans cautious. At noon, when the farm bell rang, the prisoners were given a break. Mrs. Miller brought out a large pot of stewed beans and cornbread. By regulation, POWs were to eat where they worked. She set the food on a wooden table on the porch, then stepped back, her eyes watchful. The Germans hesitated, unsure if they should touch it. The guard motioned. "Eat. That's your share." Only then did they approach. The smell of beans wafted up, the golden cornbread still steaming. A blonde-haired prisoner named Hans picked up a piece, took a tentative bite, and his eyes widened. The sweet, rich taste was unlike the dry rations at the front. He turned to a comrade and whispered in German, "My God, it's delicious." From a distance, Mrs. Miller observed, she suddenly noticed that these were just young men, hardly older than her own son. They ate politely, quietly, without the menace the newspapers had described. In the days that followed, the routine became familiar. The Germans rose early, worked until evening, then returned to camp. Mrs. Miller soon realized they were not only diligent but skilled. One former carpenter from Hamburg repaired the sagging chicken coop. Another knew how to irrigate efficiently, saving water. The once dry fields began to thrive. One afternoon, a sudden downpour drenched the prisoners. They huddled under the porch, dripping wet. Mrs. Miller looked at them, then called out, "Come inside, you'll catch cold out there." The guard raised an eyebrow, but she nodded firmly. For the first time, the prisoners crossed the threshold into an American family's home. They stood awkwardly in the small living room, surrounded by family photographs and simple floral curtains. Mrs. Miller's 10-year-old daughter whispered to her brother, "They look just like ordinary people." That evening, instead of eating on the porch, Mrs. Miller surprised them by setting extra places at the dining table. A steaming pot roast and a fragrant apple pie were placed in the center. The atmosphere was tense. No one knew how to behave. Finally, she said simply, "Sit down." The prisoners exchanged glances, then slowly pulled out chairs. In the warm glow of the lamp, enemy and host shared a table. At first, only the clink of cutlery was heard. Then one prisoner, braving his broken English, said, "Good. Food." The table burst into laughter, and the tension melted away. It was the moment the invisible wall between them began to crack. From then on, whenever the rain fell or the work was especially heavy, Mrs. Miller invited them inside to eat. Her eldest son objected at first. His father was at war, after all. But she replied, "Your father is fighting to protect humanity. If we treat them like animals, how are we any different from the enemy?" Those words stayed with her children for life. For the prisoners, those meals became unforgettable memories. One quietly tucked away a piece of apple pie in his pocket, as if to keep a fragment of kindness. Another carved a small wooden bird and gave it to the Miller girl before leaving. In 1945, when the war ended, they were loaded onto trucks to leave the farm. Before stepping aboard, Hans turned back and said softly, "Wir werden das nie vergessen." We will never forget. And indeed, years later, many former POWs recalled that the memory of the American fields and of the Miller family's dinner table had forever changed the way they thought about the enemy and about war itself. Returning from long days of farm labor, the German POWs sank back into the closed rhythm of camp life. Neat rows of wooden barracks stood inside the perimeter, encircled by barbed wire and watchtowers. By day, American guards patrolled with rifles slung over their shoulders. By night, searchlights swept the yards in steady arcs. Yet behind the stern appearance, life inside the fence took on a surprisingly different hue. Many prisoners quickly found ways to fill their idle hours. The Americans provided paper, pencils, and even books. A small library was set up in camp. From Goethe and Schiller to Dickens and Mark Twain, the POWs read, translated, and debated with enthusiasm. Some young Germans encountered Shakespeare for the very first time during captivity in America. By afternoon, the yard often turned into a soccer field. A single ball, wooden planks for goal posts, and soon shouts in German echoed across the compound. Even the American guards watching from outside smiled, sometimes applauding. Soccer was strange to many Americans, but the prisoners' passion made it a shared entertainment. Occasionally, the guards tossed in a baseball, and then both sides fumbled through each other's sports, laughing together. Music also found its place. Some men had harmonicas, others crafted makeshift guitars from wood scraps and wire. On summer nights under the moon, songs of the homeland rang out, melancholy and heartfelt. One American guard wrote in his diary, "I heard them sing some song about the Rhine. I didn't understand the words, but I could feel their homesickness. It struck me, they're just boys far from home, like us." Still, life was not always peaceful. Divisions simmered among the prisoners. German officers, held separately under regulations, clung to Nazi discipline. They mistrusted anyone who seemed too friendly with Americans, even setting up secret courts to intimidate supposed traitors. Fights sometimes broke out, forcing the guards to intervene. But most enlisted men took another path. After steady meals and days of honest work, many shed their rigid discipline. They picked up English words from the guards: bread, water, thank you. Some carefully noted them in small notebooks, treating it as a lesson for an uncertain future. The camps gradually evolved into strange little communities. Prisoners organized trade classes, carpentry, tailoring, mechanical engineering. The Americans even encouraged them to print camp newspapers, filled with articles, sketches, and satire. Published monthly in German, these papers became outlets for preserving a sense of intellectual and cultural life amid captivity. Outside the wire, American townspeople also began to change their views. At first, many feared Nazis in our backyard. But over time, seeing the POWs as polite, hard-working young men, suspicion softened. Children called them the Germans, with curiosity instead of dread. Some farmers even sent small gifts to the groups who had helped them harvest. Food became an unexpected bridge. Camp meals were steady: meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee, luxuries scarce in Europe. Many POWs wrote home, through censored letters, that they were eating better than German soldiers at the front. One prisoner confessed, "If my parents knew I was eating cornbread and drinking coffee, they would think I was dreaming." Sometimes kindness came in small, fleeting moments. One afternoon, while repairing a fence on the edge of town, a German POW picked up a rag doll dropped by a little American girl. He handed it back shyly with a clumsy smile. She nodded and chirped, "Thank you." The guard watching merely chuckled and let it pass. For many prisoners, these moments mattered most. They reminded them that, even in the land of their enemy, they were still seen as human beings. Yet inner conflict lingered. At night, when the searchlights dimmed, men sat quietly with their memories. Some worried about parents under bombing in Berlin. Others ached over comrades still fighting at the front. Guilt and loss haunted them, even as small acts of kindness shone more brightly by contrast. Historians later called these camps small German villages in America. Within the barbed wire, men studied, worked, played, wrote, and dreamed of returning home. Many admitted that their time there transformed them. Blind faith in extremism gave way to a longing for peace and normal life. As the war grew more brutal in 1944-1945, grim news reached them. Some learned of family killed by bombs. Others wept quietly over letters reporting children dead of hunger in the harsh winters. Against such grief, the camp's steady meals, soccer games, and harmonica tunes seemed surreal and weighed heavier on their conscience. For Americans, the camp stood as proof of law and humanity. Despite hatred for the enemy, they chose to treat prisoners under international standards. One U.S. officer said, "We're not fighting to become like them. If we starve or mistreat POWs, how are we any different from the Nazis?" His words resonated, echoing not only through the camps, but through the memories of former prisoners long after. By 1945, as Germany collapsed, the barbed wire in America still stood, but the men inside had changed. No longer the proud warriors of Rommel's Afrika Korps, they were men carrying layered memories, defeat, loss, and, most unexpectedly, fragments of compassion they had never imagined finding in enemy land. In May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. News reached the prison camps through radios and newspapers that the American guards allowed the prisoners to read. They heard that Berlin had fallen, Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker, and Germany had signed an unconditional surrender. Many prisoners sat in silence for hours, unable to believe it. Others broke down in tears. Some buried their heads in their arms, whispering, "So we really have lost after all." The atmosphere in the camps changed dramatically. No more whispered "Sieg Heil" in dark corners. No more swaggering Nazi officers putting on airs. In their place was emptiness, a long, heavy silence. Many young prisoners no longer knew how to picture the future. What would become of Germany? Were their families still alive? Would there even be homes to return to? The Americans, though victorious, maintained their discipline of humanity. They did not allow the prisoners to sink into despair for too long. The camp soon began announcing repatriation plans, though the process could not begin immediately. Nearly 500,000 German POWs were scattered across the United States. Bringing them back to Europe would be a massive logistical campaign. While waiting, prisoners were encouraged to continue studying. Some camps even offered advanced English classes, mechanics, and agriculture, as if preparing them for a new life. One POW later wrote in his memoir, "The Americans taught me how to plant corn and repair tractors. I never imagined those lessons would one day feed my family in the post-war years." The day of farewell came slowly, but it did come. Convoys of trucks carried prisoners out of the camps toward the eastern ports. Along the way, they caught their last glimpses of America. Fields of golden crops, quiet little towns, children running freely. Some American guards waved goodbye, others tossed cigarettes or pieces of chocolate as parting gifts. More than one prisoner was moved to tears. They imprisoned us, but they also showed us a humanity our own country never taught. Aboard the ships bound for Europe, the men gathered at the railings, staring at the horizon. They felt both eager and afraid. Eager to finally return home and see their families. Afraid because they had no idea what was left to return to. American newspapers described Germany as a heap of rubble, plagued by famine and disease. Some tried to console each other. At least we are still alive. The voyage took weeks. They were fed well on the ships, but few could eat much. The weight of uncertainty pressed too heavily. Their conversations often circled back to memories of America. Someone recalled the apple pie from a farmer's wife. Another remembered the smell of bacon in the mornings. Someone else spoke of the children's laughter during soccer games. These fragments became strange, treasured pieces of a life they had never expected to value. When they disembarked at French ports, many could hardly believe their eyes. Rows of ruined houses, streets littered with rubble, crowds of starving people begging for food. The prisoners realized the Europe they were returning to was nothing like the America they had just left behind. And when they crossed the Rhine into Germany itself, the shock deepened. Their homeland was a wasteland, cities reduced to ashes, orphans wandering the roads. One prisoner recalled, "The day I returned, my house had been flattened by bombs. My parents were dead, only my younger sister survived, thin as a shadow. I stood there, not knowing whether to hold her or break down in tears. In that moment, I remembered the cornfields of America, the meals of meat and bread, and understood what true defeat meant." For many, the shock of coming home was greater than any battlefield memory. They left America, where even as prisoners they had food, soccer, books, to return to a homeland drowning in hunger. That contrast haunted them for the rest of their lives. Yet from this experience, many POWs changed their way of thinking. No longer dreaming of empires or victories, they longed for a simple life, farming, rebuilding homes, restoring families. Some turned their backs on fascism entirely, having seen with their own eyes that the enemy could treat them more humanely than the regime that had deceived them. The memories of the American camps slowly became stories passed down in German families. They were not only the recollections of men once imprisoned, but also proof of a paradox, that in the very moment they were enemies, they were treated more humanely than many civilians back home. At a post-war gathering, a former POW once said, "In America, I learned that no enemy is forever. The Americans gave me apple pie, while in Berlin my child starved to death. I cannot forget that." Those words echo like a lesson. War may destroy everything, but how people choose to treat one another leaves the longest-lasting mark. Decades after World War II, when Germany had already recovered, those who had once been prisoners in America grew old. At reunions, they often recalled what once seemed like a humiliating chapter of their lives. but now with an entirely different tone, not of resentment, but of gratitude. In German villages on chilly winter nights, one could still hear old men telling their grandchildren, "I was once imprisoned in America, but it wasn't hell. There I ate apple pie, I played soccer, I learned English, and more importantly, I learned that even the enemy has a heart." These stories often surprise the younger generations. For in family memory, the enemy should have been associated with hatred. Yet for the former prisoners, their memories of America were tied instead to kindness, to decency amidst humanity's most brutal conflict. In many memoirs, ex-POWs would repeat three simple images: the smell of bacon in the mornings at camp, the Sunday soccer matches cheered on by American guards, and the apple pie served on the table of a farmer's family. These details became symbols of the humane treatment they had once received. They did not erase the pain of war, but softened its bitterness and planted the seeds of reconciliation. One American guard who had watched over a Texas camp later recalled in his memoir, "I saw those German boys, only a few years older than me, singing while they worked. We were enemies, but sometimes I thought, if the war had ended sooner, perhaps we could have been friends." That kindness left a lasting impact. When they returned to a devastated Germany, many POWs carried with them a painful comparison. Their enemy had treated them better than the regime they once served. It struck a heavy blow to the illusion of the Third Reich. Many admitted that their experiences in American camps made them turn decisively away from extremism, choosing instead to rebuild life on the foundation of peace. Thanks to this, when the United States launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, not a few former POWs were among those most ready to cooperate and learn. They had lived, worked, and eaten side by side with Americans. They knew that behind the political banners, Americans were simply ordinary people who also wanted a stable world. In many small American towns that had once hosted POW labor, people still kept rare memories. Some families recalled that after the war, they received letters of thanks from Germany. Written in clumsy English, they read, "Thank you for showing us kindness when we had lost everything." In some cases, American families even invited their former prisoners back to visit, transforming old enemies into genuine friends. These memories are not just personal stories. They reflect a historical truth, that even in a global war there is always room for humanity. And it is precisely such spaces that soften the cruelty of war and help heal its wounds. At a history conference in Germany, one former POW once said, "If you ask me what I learned in those years of captivity, I will say this: I learned the meaning of humanity. The Americans gave me food, but more importantly, they showed me another way of life, not based on hatred or violence." When the world looks back on World War II today, people often remember the bloody battles, the ruined cities, the brutal concentration camps. But beneath the dust of history, there remain small yet valuable fragments. A slice of apple pie, a soccer match, a shared meal. Details that might seem trivial, yet hold timeless power, because they remind us that even in war, there is room for compassion. And this is the message the story of German POWs in America leaves behind: that an enemy need not remain an enemy forever, that kindness in the darkest of times can change an entire life, and that such human memories are the foundation for reconciliation, for a Europe and a world no longer consumed by hatred. In old age, when asked what image of the war haunted him most, one former prisoner smiled and replied, "Not the bombs, not the prison camp. It was the smell of warm apple pie on an American family's table. It reminded me that even in hell there is still room for angels."